The snow fell like broken promises across the mountain trail, each flake a reminder of winter's merciless grip on the small cabin community of Pine Ridge. Maya Chen's breath formed desperate clouds in the bitter air as she struggled with the massive bundle of firewood strapped to her back, her slight frame trembling under the impossible weight. The logs had seemed manageable at the lumber yard, but now, halfway up the treacherous mountain path, they felt like the accumulated burdens of her entire life. She had been carrying everything alone for so long that the physical pain in her shoulders seemed almost natural. A cruel companion to the emotional weight she'd been shouldering since her father's death 6 months ago. The cabin, their family's refuge for 3 generations, sat another mile up the mountain, its empty windows waiting like hollow eyes for her return. Without the firewood, the pipes would freeze, and she'd lose the only thing connecting her to the memories of Sunday morning pancakes and her father's gentle humming while he carved intricate wooden birds by the fireplace. Each step forward sent shooting pains through her spine. But Maya gritted her teeth and pressed on. The alternative was unthinkable. She had already lost her job at the marketing firm in Denver when she'd taken too much time off to care for her dying father. The savings were nearly gone, and selling the cabin the realtor's suggested solution felt like betraying every story her father had told her about their family's resilience. The wind picked up, howling through the towering pines like a chorus of ghosts, and Maya stumbled. Her knees hit the frozen ground hard, and the bundle of logs shifted dangerously. For a moment, she knelt there in the snow, feeling the cold seep through her worn jeans, and wondered if this was how defeat felt, not dramatic, just quietly overwhelming. That's when she heard the footsteps. They were measured, deliberate, crunching through the snow behind her, with the confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. Maya's heart hammered as she turned, expecting to see one of the local hunters, or maybe old Pete from the general store. Instead, she found herself staring at a man she'd never seen before, broad-shouldered, with dark hair escaping from beneath a knit cap and eyes the color of storm clouds. He didn't speak. He simply walked past her, turned around, and held out his hands toward the bundle of logs. His expression was unreadable, but something in his stance suggested this wasn't a request, was a quiet statement of intent. Maya's pride flared. She'd been taking care of herself just fine. Thank you very much. She'd learned to change her own oil, fix the cabin's temperamental plumbing, and even replace the roof shingles after last spring's storm. She didn't need rescue, especially not from some stranger who probably thought she was just another city girl playing at mountain life. But as she opened her mouth to decline his help, another gust of wind nearly knocked her over, and the reality of her situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the alternative was spending another night in a freezing cabin. Listening to the pipes groan ominously in the walls, the stranger waited, patient as the mountains themselves, while she wrestled with her decision. Without a word, Maya nodded toward the logs. The stranger's hands were gentle as he helped untie the bundle, his fingers working with practiced efficiency around the knots she'd struggled with for 20 minutes at the lumber yard. When he lifted half the load onto his own shoulders, the relief was so immediate and overwhelming that Maya felt tears prick her eyes. They walked in silence, their footsteps creating a rhythm in the snow that felt oddly comforting. Maya found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion, noting the way he seemed to know exactly where to step to avoid the hidden rocks and icy patches that had been tripping her up all morning. His presence was quietly reassuring, like having a campfire on a cold night warm, without being intrusive. The stranger matched her pace perfectly, never rushing ahead or falling behind, as if he understood that this journey was about more than just carrying wood up a mountain. When they reached a particularly steep section where Maya had been dreading the climb, he simply repositioned his load and gestured for her to go first, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "I'm Maya," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the wind. She felt foolish for not introducing herself sooner, but something about his quiet presence had made words seem unnecessary. He nodded once, acknowledging her words, but didn't offer his own name in return. Some people might have found his silence rude or mysterious, but Maya discovered it was oddly peaceful. She'd grown so tired of making small talk with well-meaning neighbors who wanted to know how she was holding up, and whether she was sure about staying up there all alone. This stranger's silence felt like acceptance rather than judgment. As they climbed higher, the snow began to fall more heavily, and Maya realized she could no longer see the familiar landmarks that usually guided her home. Panic began to build. In her chest, she'd made this walk hundreds of times, but never in a storm like this. The path seemed to disappear beneath the accumulating snow, and every direction looked the same. The stranger stopped walking and waited for her to catch up. When she reached him, he pointed toward what looked like an impenetrable wall of snow-covered trees. Maya shook her head, confused, but he stepped confidently into the forest, creating a path where she couldn't see one. 20 minutes later, they emerged into the small clearing where her cabin sat, smoke rising from the chimney like a welcome beacon. Maya stared in amazement. Somehow, the stranger had led them on a shortcut that cut 15 minutes off their journey, a route she'd never noticed, despite living here for months. They stacked the wood in neat piles beside the cabin's front door, working together with an efficiency that surprised Maya. The stranger's movements were precise and economical, and she found herself unconsciously mimicking his technique. When the last log was placed, he stepped back and surveyed their work with what might have been satisfaction. Maya realized she wanted to invite him in for coffee, to warm up by the fire and maybe finally learn his name. But when she turned to ask, he was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the swirling snow as quietly as he'd appeared. She stood on her porch long after he'd vanished, watching the storm erase his footprints as if he'd never been there at all. The only proof of his existence was the neatly stacked wood and the lingering warmth of knowing that someone had cared enough to help a stranger carry her load. 3 days passed before Maya saw him again. She'd been chopping kindling behind the cabin when she heard the distinctive sound of an axe biting into wood somewhere in the forest. The rhythm was steady, methodical, and somehow familiar. Curious, she followed the sound through the trees until she found him in a small clearing, splitting logs with the kind of fluid precision that spoke of years of practice. He acknowledged her presence with a brief nod but continued working. Maya watched, fascinated by the way he moved, each swing of the axe perfectly controlled, never wasted motion, never hurried. It was almost meditative, like watching someone who had found perfect harmony between intention and action. "You're not from around here," she said, settling on a fallen log to watch him work. It wasn't really a question. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold, and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. For a moment, she thought he might actually speak, but he simply shook his head and returned to his work. Maya found herself visiting the clearing every day after that, drawn by curiosity and something deeper she couldn't name. Sometimes she brought a thermos of coffee and shared it with him during his breaks, the steam rising between them like unspoken words. Other times, she simply sat quietly, finding peace in the rhythm of his work and the comfortable silence that seemed to wrap around them. Like a warm blanket. She began to notice things about him. The way he always left a small pile of perfectly split kindling near the path where she'd find it on her way home. How he seemed to know exactly when she was struggling with something at the cabin. The morning after she'd spent hours trying to fix her stubborn generator, she'd found a new spark plug left anonymously on her doorstep. When a fallen branch had damaged her roof, she'd discovered it mysteriously repaired. While she was in town getting supplies, the people at the general store were full of theories about her silent guardian. Old Pete insisted he was probably a government agent hiding in witness protection. Sarah from the diner swore he was a heartbroken widower who'd lost his voice from grief. The teenagers whispered that he was a ghost, doomed to wander the mountains helping lost souls. Maya didn't believe any of their stories, but she couldn't deny that there was something otherworldly about the man. He seemed to appear exactly when she needed him most, and he moved through the forest with the kind of confidence that suggested intimate knowledge of every tree and trail. More than once, she'd seen him communicate with a local wildlife that didn't run from his presence, birds that seemed to respond to his gestures. One evening, as she sat by her fire reading, she heard music drifting through the trees. It was a melody she'd never heard before, played on what sounded like a wooden flute. The notes were hauntingly beautiful, full of longing and loss and hope all woven together. Maya stepped onto her porch and listened, feeling the music settle into her bones like a prayer. She followed the sound deeper into the forest than she'd ever gone before, until she found him sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape, and he was playing his flute as if the music was a conversation with the night itself. Maya stayed hidden behind a tree, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a sacred moment. As she watched, she realized that this was where his voice lived, not in words, but in the pure emotion of his music. Each note seemed to carry stories she couldn't understand, but somehow felt in her heart. When the last note faded into silence, he sat motionless for a long moment, as if listening to an echo only he could hear. Then, without turning around, He spoke his first words to her. Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone, he said, his voice rough with disuse, but warm as honey. But some people are too afraid to let others help them carry the weight. Maya stepped out from behind the tree, her heart pounding. Is that why you helped me with the logs? He turned then, and in the moonlight, she could see something vulnerable in his expression. I helped you because I recognized the weight, he said simply. I've been carrying my own for a very long time. The next morning, Maya woke to find him, sitting on her porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, and another waiting for her on the railing. The sight was so domestic, so naturally right, that she forgot to be surprised. I'm Thomas, he said as she settled beside him, cradling her warm mug. Thomas Blackwood. Maya Chen, she replied, though she suspected he already knew. How long have you been living up here? 3 years, he said, his voice still carrying that hint of rustiness. Maybe 4. Time moves differently in the mountains. She wanted to ask him why he'd chosen isolation, what had driven him to this remote life, but something in his posture warned her to be patient. Instead, she sat quietly, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. I used to be a teacher, Thomas said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. High school English, had a wife Sarah. We were trying to have kids. Maya's heart clenched at the past tense, but she remained silent, sensing that this was a story he'd never told anyone. Car accident, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Black ice on Highway 7. I was driving. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She was pregnant. We'd just found out the week before. Maya felt tears spring to her eyes, but she blinked them away, knowing that her grief would only make his harder to bear. I'm sorry, she said softly. Thomas nodded, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. After that, I couldn't stand being around people. Everyone wanted to help, to talk about it, to make it better somehow. But there was no making it better. There was just the weight of it, pressing down on me every day. So you came here? Maya said. I came here to disappear, he corrected. But the mountains don't let you disappear. They just teach you to carry the weight differently. Maya understood. She'd felt that same crushing pressure after her father's death. The way well-meaning friends and colleagues had tried to rush her through her grief, as if it were an inconvenience to be quickly overcome. People mean well, she said. But sometimes, their help feels like judgment. Exactly. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been relief. Like you're not grieving the right way, or fast enough, or productively enough. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Maya found herself thinking about all the times she'd seen Thomas over the past few weeks, always helping, always giving, never taking anything for himself. Why did you help me? She asked finally. Thomas was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That sometimes the weight we carry isn't meant to crush us, it's meant to make us stronger. But only if we're not carrying it alone. And sometimes, Maya added, helping someone else carry their burden is the only way to make your own feel lighter. Thomas turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a wall coming down, a door opening. I've been alone for so long, he said. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to share the load. Maya reached over and touched his hand, feeling the calluses from years of chopping wood and the slight tremor that spoke of vulnerability. Maybe we could try sharing it, she said. The load, I mean. I've been carrying mine alone for 6 months, and it's only getting heavier. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, and when he looked back up, Maya saw something she hadn't seen before. I'd like that, he said simply, as if to seal their agreement. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley. Maya took it as a good sign, a blessing from the mountains that had taught them both about the weight of solitude and the grace of shared burdens. The partnership began slowly, tentatively, like two wounded animals learning to trust again. Thomas would appear at Maya's cabin in the early morning, and they'd work together on the endless tasks that mountain living demanded: splitting wood, repairing the generator, winterizing the water pipes. Maya discovered that everything was easier with 2 people, not just because of the extra hands, but because of the companionship that made even the most tedious chores feel manageable. Thomas was a patient teacher, showing Maya how to read the subtle signs of approaching weather, how to identify the tracks of different animals in the snow, how to find the best fallen timber for firewood. In return, Maya shared her own skills, the business knowledge that helped her stretch her dwindling savings, the cooking techniques she'd learned from her father. The stories about the cabin's history that brought its weathered walls to life. Your father built this place? Thomas asked one evening as they sat by the fire, sharing a dinner of venison stew and fresh bread. My great-grandfather started it, Maya replied, running her hand along the smooth log walls. Just a one-room hunting cabin back then. Each generation added something my grandfather put in the plumbing. My father added the second bedroom and the wraparound porch. He always said the cabin grew with the family's needs. Thomas nodded, understanding. What would you add? Maya considered the question seriously. I used to think I'd want a bigger kitchen, maybe a workshop for my father's wood-carving tools. But lately, I've been thinking about a greenhouse. Somewhere to grow things, even in winter. A greenhouse would be perfect here, Thomas said, his eyes lighting up with interest. There's a spot on the south side where the sun hits just right. Good drainage, protection from the wind. They began planning it that night, sketching rough designs on the backs of envelopes and discussing the practical challenges of building in such a remote location. Maya found herself looking forward to the project, not just because of the end result, but because of the process, the way Thomas listened to her ideas, built on them, made them better without dismissing her original vision. As the weeks passed, their friendship deepened in unexpected ways. Thomas began talking more, sharing memories of his life before the accident, funny stories about his students, adventures from his camping trips with Sarah, the small daily pleasures that had made up his former happiness. Maya found herself opening up to telling him about her corporate job that had felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, her father's gentle wisdom, her dreams of using the cabin as a retreat for other people who needed healing. Like a sanctuary, Thomas said when she described her vision. Exactly. Somewhere people could come to carry their burdens differently, like you said, not to forget them, but to learn to live with them. One snowy afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of the cabin's foundation, Thomas paused in his work and looked at Maya with an expression she couldn't read. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. I haven't laughed in 3 years, he said quietly. Not really laughed. But you made me laugh yesterday when you were trying to catch that escaped chicken. Maya felt her cheeks warm. I'm glad I could provide entertainment. It's not entertainment, Thomas said seriously. It's hope. You made me remember that joy is still possible, even when you're carrying something heavy. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas pulled out his wooden flute and played the haunting melody Maya had heard that first night. But this time, when he finished, he looked at her and said, I wrote that song for Sarah. It was going to be a lullaby for our baby. Maya felt tears prick her eyes. It's beautiful. I thought it would always be too painful to play, Thomas continued. But tonight, it felt like sharing something precious, instead of just grieving something lost. Maya reached over and took his hand. Thank you for sharing it with me. Thomas squeezed her fingers gently. Thank you for teaching me that sharing doesn't always mean losing. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside the cabin, wrapped in firelight and growing trust, Maya felt warmer than she had in months. She was beginning to understand that love wasn't about finding someone to carry your burdens for you. It was about finding someone who made you strong enough to carry them yourself, and generous enough to help them carry theirs. February arrived, with a vengeance, bringing the worst blizzard Pine Ridge had seen in decades. Maya woke to find her cabin completely buried in snow. The windows blocked and the door sealed shut by drifts that reached nearly to the roof. The power had gone out sometime during the night, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world had been muffled in cotton. She was trying to dig her way out through the kitchen window when she heard the rhythmic sound of shoveling. Thomas's voice carried through the snow, steady and reassuring. Stay inside, Maya. I'll have you out in an hour. But it took 3 hours to dig a path to her door, and when Thomas finally appeared, he was exhausted, his face red with cold and exertion. Maya pulled him inside, wrapping him in blankets and pressing hot coffee into his hands. My cabin's completely snowed in, he said through chattering teeth. Roof might not hold much more weight. You'll stay here, Maya said without hesitation, until the storm passes. Thomas started to protest, but Maya cut him off. We're sharing the load, remember? That includes shelter. The storm raged for 3 days, and Maya discovered that living in close quarters with Thomas was both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier because they'd already established a comfortable rhythm of shared tasks and comfortable silences. Harder because the intimacy of the situation, sharing meals, taking turns reading aloud by the fire, falling asleep to the sound of each other's breathing, made her increasingly aware of feelings she'd been trying to ignore. On the second night, Maya woke to find Thomas sitting by the dying fire, his face drawn with pain. He was holding a small photograph, and even in the dim light, she could see the tears on his cheeks. Today would have been Sarah's birthday, he said without looking up. She would have been 32. Maya sat beside him on the couch, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to give him space. Tell me about her, she said softly. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion, as he described his wife, her laugh that could fill a room, her terrible cooking that he'd eaten gratefully. For 5 years, her dream of teaching their children to love literature the way she did. As he talked, Maya felt a complex mix of emotions: grief for his loss, gratitude for his willingness to share such precious memories, and something else that she was ashamed to acknowledge: jealousy. She sounds wonderful, Maya said when he finished, and meant it. She was, Thomas replied, and I loved her with everything I had. But Maya, ... He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to love someone new, without feeling like I'm betraying her memory. Maya's heart clenched. She'd been wondering the same thing about her own growing feelings. But hearing Thomas's voice, the struggle made it real, in a way that was both terrifying and relieving. Maybe, she said carefully, love isn't a finite resource. Maybe loving someone new doesn't mean loving someone else less. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I want to believe that, he said finally. But I'm scared. I'm scared of losing someone, again, and I'm scared of not being enough for someone who deserves everything. Maya reached over and took the photograph from his hands, looking at the image of a laughing woman with kind eyes and wind-blown hair. She looks like someone who would want you to be happy, she said. Someone who would understand that the heart can hold more than one love. Thomas looked at her with such intensity that Maya felt her breath catch. What if I'm not ready? He asked. Then we wait, Maya said simply. We take it one day at a time, and we don't rush anything. But Thomas, I need you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Whether you're ready now or in a year or in 10 years, I'm here. Because this isn't just about romantic love. This is about building something together, about being partners in whatever comes. Thomas reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears. She didn't realize she'd been crying. I love you, he whispered. It terrifies me, but I love you. Maya leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. I love you too, she replied. And we're going to figure this out together. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. They'd weathered their first real emotional storm, and they'd done it by facing their fears together instead of carrying them alone. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow and revealing the green shoots of new life pushing through the winter-hardened earth. Maya and Thomas began work on the greenhouse, their hands learning to work together with the same harmony they'd found in conversation. Thomas had been right about the location. The south-facing spot caught the morning sun perfectly and was protected from the harsh mountain winds. Foundation first, Thomas said, standing hip-deep in the hole they'd been digging for 2 days. Everything depends on a solid foundation. Maya smiled at the metaphor, whether intentional or not. They'd been building their own foundation for months now, learning each other's rhythms, discovering how to support each other's weight without losing their own balance. The physical work was demanding, but satisfying. Maya's hands grew calloused from handling lumber and tools, and her back ached from the constant bending and lifting. But she'd never felt stronger or more capable. Thomas was an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled with a new skill. You're a natural, he said one afternoon, as she successfully measured and cut a perfect joint for the frame. Your father would be proud. Maya felt a familiar pang at the mention of her father, but it was softer now, more like a gentle ache than a sharp pain. He always said I had good hands, she replied. I just never had the confidence to use them. Confidence comes with practice, Thomas said, running his fingers along the smooth wood. And with having someone who believes in you. As the greenhouse took shape, Maya found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't dared to before. She'd been so focused on surviving each day that she'd forgotten about the possibility of thriving. But watching their project grow from an idea to a reality made her remember that she was capable of creating something beautiful, something lasting. What will you grow first? Thomas asked, as they installed the final pane of glass. Maya considered the question. Herbs, I think. Basil and rosemary, maybe some lettuce. Simple things that will give us confidence. She paused, looking at him thoughtfully. What about you? What would you like to grow? Thomas's answer surprised her. Flowers, he said. I want to grow flowers for Sarah's grave. She loved sunflowers, said they were proof that something beautiful could grow from dirt and water and stubbornness. Maya felt her heart constrict, but not with jealousy this time. With love for Thomas, for his devotion to Sarah's memory, for the way he was learning to honor the past while building a future. We'll grow the most beautiful sunflowers these mountains have ever seen, she promised that evening. As they sat on the porch, admiring their completed greenhouse, Thomas pulled out his flute and played a new melody, one that was lighter than the lullaby, full of hope and possibility. That's beautiful, Maya said when he finished. Did you write it? Today, Thomas replied. While we were working. It just came to me. Maya understood. The music was about building something new while honoring what came before. It was about finding joy without forgetting sorrow, about moving forward without leaving the past behind. I've been thinking, Thomas said, setting down his flute, about your idea for a sanctuary. People who need a place to heal. Oh, this place ... What we're building here is not just about us, is it? It's about creating something that could help others the way it's helped us. Maya felt a flutter of excitement. You mean actually do it? Open our home to people who need healing? Why not? Thomas said. We have the space, the knowledge, the experience. We know what it's like to carry weight that feels impossible to bear. Maybe we could teach others what the mountains taught us. Maya looked out over the valley, imagining it filled with people who'd come seeking the same peace she'd found. It would be a big undertaking, she said practically. We'd need permits, insurance, facilities. We'd need to build it slowly, Thomas agreed. One step at a time, like everything else we've done. But Maya, I think this is what we're meant to do. I think this is why we found each other. As they talked late into the night, planning and dreaming, Maya felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. They weren't just building a greenhouse or a relationship, they were building a legacy. A place where broken people could learn to carry their burdens with grace and dignity. Sarah would have loved this, Thomas said, as they finally prepared for bed. She always said her favorite part of teaching was helping students find their own strength. Maya kissed him softly. Then we'll make sure she's part of it too. Every person we help, every life we touch will be her legacy as much as ours. By midsummer, the greenhouse was producing more than Maya had dared to hope. The herbs grew in fragrant abundance, the lettuce was crisp and sweet, and Thomas's sunflowers were beginning to tower over everything else, their faces following the sun like faithful disciples. But the real harvest was the transformation in both of them. Maya had stopped thinking of herself as someone who was barely surviving. She woke each morning eager to see what new growth the day would bring, not just in the greenhouse, but in herself. The muscles in her arms had strengthened from the physical work. But more importantly, the muscles of her confidence had grown too. She could fix almost anything that broke, build almost anything she could envision, and carry loads that would have crushed her a year ago. Thomas had begun to smile more easily, to laugh without the shadow of guilt that had once clouded his joy. He still talked about Sarah, but now the conversations were celebrations of her life, rather than mourning for her death. Maya had learned to love these stories, to feel honored that he trusted her with his most precious memories. We should have a celebration, Maya said one evening, as they harvested the first tomatoes of the season. For the greenhouse. For our first real harvest. What kind of celebration? Thomas asked, biting into a sun-warmed tomato and closing his eyes in appreciation. A dinner party, Maya said, the idea forming as she spoke. Invite the people from town who've been so kind to us. Show them what we've built together. Thomas looked uncertain. I'm not sure I'm ready for that many people. Maya understood his hesitation. It had been just the two of them for so long. Their world had become perfectly contained. But she also knew that healing sometimes meant expanding beyond the comfortable boundaries you'd created. We don't have to invite everyone, she said gently, just a few people. Pete from the general store, Sarah from the diner, maybe the Johnsons from down the valley. People who've been part of our journey without even knowing it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said. But if I get overwhelmed, then we'll handle it together, Maya promised. Like everything else. The dinner party was a revelation. Maya had forgotten how much she enjoyed cooking for people, how satisfying it was to watch faces light up when they tasted something she'd prepared with love. Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, by being a gracious host, sharing stories about the greenhouse construction and even playing his flute after dinner. This place has magic in it, said Mrs. Johnson, a widow who'd been struggling since her husband's death the previous winter. I can feel it in the air, in the way you to look at each other, in the peace that settles over you when you're here. Maya and Thomas exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Mrs. Johnson would be perfect for their sanctuary ideas. Someone who understood loss, but wasn't completely broken by it. Someone who could benefit from the healing they'd found in shared work and quiet companionship. Mrs. Johnson, Maya said carefully, how would you feel about helping us with a project? We're thinking about creating a kind of retreat here, a place where people can come to heal and learn to live with their grief. The older woman's eyes lit up. You mean like a working vacation? Where people could help with the gardens and the building while they sort through their own troubles. Exactly, Thomas said, his voice growing more confident. We've learned that physical work can be a kind of meditation, a way to process emotions that feel too big for words. By the end of the evening, they had their first unofficial collaborator, and a clearer vision of what their sanctuary could become. It wouldn't be a traditional retreat center, with scheduled activities and formal counseling. Instead, it would be a working farm, where people could come to contribute their labor while healing their hearts. We'll need to start small, Maya said, as they cleaned up after their guests had left. Maybe 1 or 2 people at a time, staying for a week or two. And we'll need to be careful about who we invite, Thomas added. Not everyone is ready for the kind of healing that comes from hard work and quiet reflection. Maya nodded, thinking about their own journey. They'd both been ready to do the work when they met, even if they hadn't known it. The key would be finding others who were at the same place in their healing past. The initial shock of loss, but not yet sure how to move forward. I think Mrs. Johnson would be perfect to help us develop the program, Maya said. She understands loss, but she's also practical and organized, and she knows everyone in the valley. Thomas pulled Maya close, and she could feel his contentment in the way he held her. 1 year ago, I was living like a hermit, convinced that isolation was the only way to survive my grief, he said. Now I'm planning to open our home to strangers. Not strangers, Maya corrected. People who need what we've learned to offer. People who are carrying loads too heavy for one person to bear. As they stood together in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their first successful dinner party, Maya felt a profound sense of gratitude. They'd learned to carry each other's burdens, and now they were ready to help others learn the same lesson. The first official guest arrived on a crisp October morning, carrying a single suitcase and a grief so palpable it seemed to weigh down the very air around him. David was a recently retired firefighter, whose wife had died in a car accident 3 months earlier. He'd heard about Maya and Thomas through Mrs. Johnson, who'd become their unofficial coordinator, and had developed an uncanny ability to identify people who were ready for mountain healing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, David said, as Maya showed him to the small cabin they'd built as guest quarters. I'm not much of a farmer. Neither was I, Maya replied with a smile, but it turns out that's not really the point. David settled into their routine with surprising ease. He worked alongside Thomas splitting wood and repairing fences. His firefighter's strength and precision making him a natural at the physical tasks. But it was the quiet conversations over coffee at dawn that seemed to help him most the way. Thomas listened without trying to fix anything, the way he shared his own struggles without making them about himself. I keep thinking I should have been able to save her, David said one morning, his hands wrapped around his steaming mug. I've saved so many strangers over the years, but I couldn't save the one person who mattered most. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of survivor's guilt. The hardest lesson I learned was that love isn't about being able to prevent every bad thing from happening. It's about being present for the good things, and holding space for the grief when the bad things come anyway. Maya watched from the kitchen window as the two men sat in comfortable silence, and she felt a deep satisfaction. This was what they'd envisioned, not a place where people came to be fixed, but a place where they could learn to carry their pain with dignity and grace. David stayed for 3 weeks, and by the time he left, the permanent furrows of grief in his forehead had softened. He'd learned to split wood with meditative precision, to read the subtle signs of changing weather, and most importantly, to talk about his wife with love rather than only loss. I'm not healed, he told them on his last morning. I don't think I ever will be, completely, but I'm not drowning anymore, either. I've learned to swim with the weight instead of fighting it. Word spread quietly through the networks of grief that exist in every community. A teacher who'd lost her teenage son in a climbing accident. A veteran struggling with PTSD and the loss of his squad. A young mother whose husband had died of cancer, leaving her with 2 small children and no idea how to move forward. They came in a steady trickle, never more than 2 at a time, staying for weeks or sometimes months. Each person brought their own story, their own particular burden. But they all found the same things. At Pine Ridge, work that engaged their hands and quieted their minds. Companions who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting, and the gradual discovery that they were stronger than they'd believed. Maya and Thomas developed an intuitive understanding of what each person needed. Some, like David, needed to exhaust themselves with physical labor until their bodies were too tired to maintain the constant tension of grief. Others needed gentle tasks, tending seedlings in the greenhouse, preparing meals that nourished both body and spirit. A few needed creative outlets, and Thomas began teaching basic woodworking while Maya shared her father's carving techniques. "We're not therapists," Maya said to Thomas one evening, as they debriefed after a particularly challenging day with a guest who'd been struggling with anger. "But maybe that's what makes this work. We're just fellow travelers who've learned to carry our loads a little better." "The mountains are the real therapists," Thomas replied. "We're just translators, helping people understand what the wilderness is trying to teach them." As autumn deepened into winter, they prepared for their first full year of operation. The guest cabin was winterized, the greenhouse was producing enough food to feed everyone, and they'd developed a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than overwhelming. But their greatest success was something they hadn't expected: the way their guests began to help each other. The veteran taught the grieving mother how to identify different types of trees. The teacher showed the young widow how to preserve vegetables for winter. Without any formal structure, a community of healers was forming, each person contributing their unique gifts to the collective work of recovery. "I think we've created something special here," Maya said as they watched their current guests working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by an early snow. "Not just a place where people come to heal, but a place where healing becomes a way of life." Thomas nodded, his arm tightening around her waist. "Sarah would have loved this," he said, and for the first time, the statement carried pure joy instead of sadness. She always said that the best way to heal yourself was to help heal others. 2 years after that first snowy encounter on the mountain path, Maya stood in the same spot where she'd once struggled with a load too heavy to bear. But now she wasn't alone. Thomas walked beside her, and behind them came a small group of their current guests, a mix of people at different stages of their healing journeys. All of them carrying supplies for the new meditation pavilion they were building on the ridge. "Remember when you could barely make it up this hill with a bundle of firewood?" Thomas teased, watching Maya effortlessly balance a bag of tools and a thermos of hot coffee. "I remember someone appearing out of nowhere to help me," Maya replied, bumping his shoulder affectionately. "Like some kind of mountain guardian angel. More like a mountain hermit who forgot how to talk to people," Thomas corrected with a laugh. Behind them, their guests were engaged in their own conversations. Zana, the young teacher, was explaining local bird calls to Marcus, the veteran who'd arrived angry and left peaceful 3 months later but had chosen to stay on as a permanent resident. Alina, still raw from her husband's death, but finding strength in the daily rhythms of mountain life, was listening to David's stories about his firefighting days. He'd become a regular visitor, returning every few months to help with major projects, and to check on his own healing progress. The meditation pavilion had been Lena's idea: quiet space, where people could sit with their grief without feeling the need to be productive or useful. Maya had been skeptical at first, worried that too much stillness might be counterproductive, but Thomas had understood immediately. "Sometimes the work is to sit with the pain," he'd said, "to let it exist without trying to transform it into something else." As they reached the building site, Maya marveled at how natural it felt to be leading this odd little family of broken and healing people. 2 years ago, she'd been convinced she was destined to struggle alone. Now she was surrounded by people who'd learned, like her, that shared burdens were not only lighter, but somehow more meaningful. "Okay, everyone," she called out, slipping easily into the leadership role she'd never sought but had grown to embrace. "Thomas and Marcus will handle the foundation work. Anna and Alina, you're on tool organization. David, you're with me on the support beams." They worked in comfortable harmony, their different strengths and skills complementing each other perfectly. Maya found herself thinking about the business plan she'd written during the winter, outlining their vision for expanding the sanctuary. They'd been approached by a grief counselor in Denver who wanted to refer clients, and by a veterans organization interested in funding a specialized program for combat trauma. "We're going to need more cabins," she said to Thomas during a break, gesturing toward the valley below where they'd identified sites for additional guest quarters. "And more staff," Thomas added. "We can't keep doing this alone, as much as we love it." Maya nodded, thinking about the conversation they'd had the night before about hiring some of their former guests as permanent staff. Marcus had already expressed interest in staying on as a grounds manager, and Anna had suggested developing an educational program for children who'd experienced loss. It's scary, Maya admitted. Growing this big, what if we lose what makes this place special? Thomas reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses that had become badges of honor. We won't lose it because we're not growing for the sake of growing. We're growing because there are more people who need what we've learned to offer. As the afternoon wore on, Maya found herself watching Thomas work with the same quiet competence that had first drawn her to him. But now she knew the stories behind his confidence, the grief that had shaped his gentle strength, the love that had taught him to build rather than just survive. I love you, she said suddenly, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd built together. Thomas looked up from the beam he was measuring, his face lighting up with the smile that still made her heart skip. I love you too, he said. All of your stubbornness, your vision, your terrible habit of trying to carry everything yourself. I don't do that anymore, Maya protested. You do, Thomas said fondly. But now you let me help you carry it. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, they gathered their tools and prepared to head back down the mountain. The pavilion's foundation was complete, and tomorrow, they'd return to continue the work. You know what I realized today? Alina said as they walked, her voice carrying a note of wonder. I've been here for 2 months, and this is the first day I woke up without immediately thinking about how much I miss him. I still miss him, she added quickly. But it wasn't the first thing, you know. Maya felt tears prick her eyes. This was why they did the work, not to help people forget their losses, but to help them remember that they were more than just their grief. That's how it starts, Thomas said gently. One day at a time, one moment at a time. You learn to carry the love alongside the loss. As they crested the hill that overlooked the cabin, Maya saw the lights already glowing in the windows. Mrs. Johnson had stayed behind to prepare dinner, and the warm yellow glow was a beacon of welcome and belonging. 2 years ago, this sight would have meant simple survival. Now it meant home, family, purpose. Look at that, she said to Thomas, gesturing toward the scene below. We built something beautiful. Thomas squeezed her hand. We built something necessary, he corrected. And we did it by learning to carry each other's weight. Maya smiled, thinking about the logs that had brought them together. The literal burden that had become a metaphor for everything they'd learned about love and loss and healing. She'd tried to carry them alone. But the silent stranger who'd taken half the load had taught her that the heaviest burdens were meant to be shared, not to make them disappear, but to make them bearable, meaningful, and ultimately transformative. As they walked down the mountain toward home, surrounded by their chosen family of healers and helpers, Maya felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with reaching a destination, and everything to do with understanding the journey. They'd learned that love wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about finding someone who made you strong enough to carry it with grace, and generous enough to help others do the same. Behind them, the Meditation Pavilion's foundation sat ready for tomorrow's work, solid and purposeful against the mountain landscape. Like their love, like their healing, like their life together, it was built to last, not because it was perfect, but because it was built on the unshakable foundation of shared burdens and mutual support. The circle was complete, but the story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new challenges, new opportunities to practice the art of carrying weight together. And Maya and Thomas would meet them all the way they'd learned, to meet everything side by side, ready to share the load. In the end, love is not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who makes you brave enough to be complete yourself, and generous enough to help others find their own wholeness. Maya and Thomas discovered that the heaviest burdens become the strongest foundations when they're shared with willing hearts and patient hands. Their sanctuary in the mountains continues to this day, a testament to the truth that healing is not a destination but a way of traveling, preferably with someone who understands that the journey is always lighter when you're not walking alone.